Hello, everyone. Thank you all for who tuned in to today's Tuesday webinar, and in the event anyone that didn't, just providing a very brief recap on what I presented on today, which is a very brief overview on religious and medical accommodation requests, specifically in the vaccine context, which we have been seeing an uptick during the last 5 years, as most people are aware, in relation to the COVID-19 vaccine, but we're also starting to see challenges for other vaccination requests. So as a very general principle, the obligation to potentially accommodate an employee for a religious accommodation request or a medical accommodation request arise under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 or the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. So generally speaking, this is applicable to both a religious or a medical accommodation. It does require an employee to accommodate either an employee's religious belief or medical needs, unless doing so creates an undue hardship for the employer's business. One point I mentioned was a somewhat recent decision from the Supreme Court in 2023, which raised the standard or effectively the bar of what constitutes an undue burden, which is a generalized test of looking at if the accommodation would result in substantial increased costs in relation to the particular business, taking into account all relevant factors at hand. One important point to note, and this is particularly applicable as to an exemption an exemption to a vaccine mandate, is if an employer is working in a healthcare setting or a school, for example, whether that accommodation would result in an unreasonable increase in the risk to public health or safety. And another general point to consider is that a reasonable accommodation request, generally speaking, automatically does constitute an undue hardship if it requires the employer to violate a local, state, or a federal law. Specifically regarding a religious accommodation request, an employee must demonstrate a sincerely held religious belief, which would prohibit them from, in this specific case, complying with the vaccine mandate. An employer does have the ability to request information to understand the sincerity of this religious belief a little bit, but this should be handled on a case-by-case basis as to whether or not that is in fact actually necessary. Now, similarly, for a medical accommodation request, and again, specifically in the context of a medical accommodation in relation to a vaccine mandate, an employer is allowed to ask for information regarding a disability or medical condition to understand the need for the exemption request. And further and specifically, employers may ask for an explanation from a medical provider as to why an employee's disability or medical condition would be a danger to the employee. As a general broad stroke rule and principle, any accommodation request should always be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. And as these can be sometimes tricky analysis to conduct, we do recommend that whenever in doubt to either contact your contact at Bond or any other legal professional that you regularly work with. Thank you all very much.